On April 13, 2026, the United States Navy began physically blocking ships from entering or leaving Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a hypothetical. That is not a war game. That is happening right now, today, as you are watching this video. Two American guided missile destroyers crossed through the narrowest choke point on Earth, a waterway barely 21 miles wide at its tightest, and the United States government told every single vessel flying every single flag on the planet that if you are heading to an Iranian port, you will be turned around. And if you paid Iran a toll to get through the strait, the President of the United States personally said he will find your ship and intercept it. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because what I am about to show you is that this one decision, this single military maneuver in a waterway most Americans cannot find on a map, has the power to change the price of everything you buy, everything you eat, everything you drive, and everything you heat your home with for the rest of this year, and possibly for years after that. And the scariest part is not the blockade itself. The scariest part is that most people in this country have absolutely no idea how exposed we actually are. They think America is energy independent. They think we produce all our own oil. They think the Middle East does not matter anymore. And every single one of those beliefs is dangerously, catastrophically wrong. So let me walk you through exactly what is happening, exactly why it matters, and exactly what it means for your wallet, your family, and your future. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something that the vast majority of Americans still do not. Let me start with the number that should terrify every single person watching this. 20%. That is how much of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. We are not talking about a pipeline. We are not talking about a shipping lane that carries some oil. We are talking about the single most important energy choke point on the face of the Earth. Before February 28, 2026, more than 100 vessels passed through that strait every single day. Supertankers carrying 2 million barrels each. LNG carriers feeding power grids across Asia and Europe. Chemical tankers moving the raw materials that become your fertilizer, your plastic packaging, your pharmaceutical drugs, and then the bombs started falling. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, striking Iranian leadership and military infrastructure simultaneously. Iran retaliated with missile and drone strikes on American bases in Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain. And within days, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps got on the radio and transmitted a message that changed the global economy overnight. No ships will be permitted to pass. Ship tracking data showed a 70% reduction in traffic within the first 48 hours. By March 1st and 2nd, not a single vessel appeared in the strait. Maersk, the largest container shipping company on Earth, suspended all transits. CMA CGM followed. Hapag-Lloyd followed. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest since last year. Not the largest since the Gulf War. The largest ever. And you need to understand what that actually means for the country you live in, because the consequences are already hitting your bank account, whether you realize it or not. Here is something that almost nobody in this country understands, and it is the single most important fact in this entire video. The United States of America produces roughly 13.2 million barrels of crude oil per day. That makes us the largest oil producer on Earth. And when politicians stand at a podium and tell you we are energy independent, they are telling you a version of the truth that is so misleading it might as well be a lie. Because the oil we produce is the wrong kind of oil for the refineries we built. Let me explain what that means. The United States overwhelmingly produces light, sweet crude oil. That is the stuff that comes out of the Permian Basin in Texas, the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, the Eagle Ford Shale. It is low in sulfur, low in density, and relatively easy to refine. Sounds great, right? Here is the problem. Over 60% of American refinery capacity was built decades ago to process heavy, sour crude oil. That is the thick, high-sulfur, high-density crude that comes from places like Canada, Venezuela, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. Our refineries were designed in the 1970s and 1980s around the assumption that we would always be importing heavy crude from the Middle East and Latin America. They invested billions of dollars in coking units and hydrocracking towers that are specifically engineered to break down heavy, dirty crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. You cannot just swap in light shale oil and expect those refineries to run at full capacity. It does not work that way. The chemistry is different. The economics are different. Upgrading a single refinery to handle a different grade of crude oil costs between $100 million and $1 billion, and the process takes 3 to 6 months even if you start today. So what does the United States actually do with all that light crude oil it produces? It exports it. In 2024, the U.S. exported nearly 4 million barrels per day of crude oil to countries whose refineries are designed for light oil, places like South Korea, the Netherlands, India, and the United Kingdom. And simultaneously, American refiners imported millions of barrels per day of heavy crude to feed their aging infrastructure. We are the largest oil producer on the planet, and we still imported 6.8 million barrels per day in recent years because our refineries physically cannot run on what we drill out of our own ground. That is the dirty secret that no politician wants to explain to you at a rally. That is the vulnerability that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz just ripped wide open. Now let me show you what happened to the price of everything you buy in the 6 weeks since this crisis started, because the numbers are staggering and they are accelerating. On February 27th, the day before the war began, the national average for a gallon of regular gasoline was $2.98. As of this week, AAA reports the national average has hit $4.16. That is a 40% increase in less than 7 weeks. In California, the average has blown past $4.59 a gallon. In San Francisco, drivers are paying $4.80. A Shell station in San Francisco was photographed on March 12th, selling regular unleaded at $6.50 a gallon. $6.50. For regular and diesel, the fuel that moves every single product in this country on the back of a truck, is even worse. The Energy Information Administration's April 2026 Outlook projects diesel prices will peak above $5.80 per gallon this month. That is the fuel that powers the 3.5 million trucks that carry 72% of all freight in America by weight. Every single thing on the shelf at your grocery store, every package at your front door, every pallet of medicine at your pharmacy, it got there on diesel. And diesel just became 40 to 50% more expensive than it was 2 months ago. The American trucking associations have been sounding the alarm for weeks. Small carriers, the companies with fewer than 50 trucks that make up the vast majority of the trucking industry, are operating on profit margins between 3 and 7%. When your single largest expense nearly doubles overnight, those margins do not shrink. They evaporate. Owner-operators are parking their rigs. A trucker in South Dakota who runs a small company told reporters that when he fills up his 18-wheeler, the pump hits $999 and shuts off before the tank is even full. That is not a metaphor. That is literally what is happening at fuel stops across America right now. And every truck that parks is one less vehicle moving the goods that fill your stores. But fuel is only the beginning of this cascade, and this is the part that is going to hit your family directly in the next 60 to 90 days if it has not already. The Persian Gulf is not just an oil highway, it is the fertilizer capital of the world. Gulf states produce nearly 49% of global urea exports and 30% of global ammonia exports. Urea is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer on the planet. It is what American farmers spread on their fields to grow the corn, the wheat, the soybeans, the rice that feeds this country and a significant portion of the world. And roughly 1/3 of the entire global supply of urea transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Since the strait closed, urea prices have already surged 35%. Almost half of the world's supply of sulfur, a critical byproduct of oil and gas refining that is essential for producing fertilizers, also comes from the Gulf. The American Farm Bureau Federation's president wrote a public letter warning that the United States risks a shortfall in crops. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the organization that represents American agriculture. A shortfall in crops in the United States of America in 2026, and the timing could not possibly be worse. American farmers are entering the spring planting season right now. This is the window. This is the 2 to 3 months where the decisions that determine whether we have a full harvest in the fall get made. If fertilizer is not available, or if it is priced so high that farmers cannot afford to apply it at the recommended rates, yields will drop. There is no catching up later. You cannot go back in August and add the nitrogen you should have applied in April. The growing cycle does not work that way. And the USDA has already projected food prices will increase by 3.6% in 2026, but that estimate was made before the strait closed. An economist at the University of Minnesota who directs the Heller-Hurwich Economics Institute said plainly that the price of food is going to move quite a lot. Fossil fuels used to produce oil, diesel, and fertilizer account for between 15 and 30% of produce costs. When those input costs spike by 30 to 50%, that math flows directly to the checkout line. And I want you to think about what a crop shortfall actually looks like in practice, because most Americans have never lived through one. It does not mean empty shelves overnight. It means gradual thinning. It means the 12-ounce bag of frozen vegetables that used to cost $1.99 is now $2.49. It means the gallon of milk goes from $3.80 to $4.50. It means the loaf of bread creeps from $3 to $3.75. None of those individual increases sound catastrophic. But when every single item in your cart goes up by 15 or 20 or 25%, the total at the bottom of your receipt tells a different story. A family spending $600 a month on groceries is now spending $720. That is $1,440 a year that just disappeared from their budget. And that is before we even talk about what rising diesel costs do to the price of shipping food from farms to warehouses to stores. The trucking surcharge alone is adding an invisible tax to every item on the shelf, and most consumers will never see a line item for it. They will just see higher prices and wonder why everything keeps getting more expensive. And it is not just produce. It is everything wrapped in plastic, which is a petrochemical product. It is everything shipped in a cardboard box, because those boxes are made in factories powered by natural gas. It is the meat in your freezer, because livestock eat feed grown with fertilizer transported by diesel trucks. Every layer of the food system touches energy, and energy just got dramatically more expensive. Now let me talk about something that should genuinely alarm you about the strategic position of the United States right now, because it reveals just how thin the safety net actually is. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve. You have heard that term. Politicians love to talk about it. It sounds reassuring, like a giant underground savings account full of oil that we can tap whenever we need it. And it is real. It is stored in massive salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, and at its peak in 2009, it held 727 million barrels. That was the plan. That was the insurance policy built after the 1973 Arab oil embargo to make sure this country would never be held hostage by foreign oil again. But here is what they do not tell you. As of the end of 2025, the SPR held approximately 411 million barrels. That is already 42% below its peak capacity. And on March 11th, the Trump administration authorized the release of 172 million barrels as part of a coordinated International Energy Agency drawdown of 400 million barrels across 32 member nations. 172 million barrels. That is more than 40% of what was left. The Department of Energy has already issued requests for proposals to exchange 86 million barrels in the first tranche, followed by another 30 million in early April. They structured it as an exchange rather than a sale, meaning oil companies receive barrels now and are supposed to return a larger quantity later. But the timeline for that return stretches into next year, and the price they will pay to return those barrels depends on market conditions that nobody can predict in the middle of a war. Do the math. If the SPR started this crisis with roughly 415 million barrels and we are releasing 172 million, we are drawing it down to approximately 243 million barrels. The authorized capacity of the reserve is 714 million barrels. We would be at 34% of capacity, the lowest level since the early 1980s, when the reserve was still being filled for the first time. And the maximum withdrawal rate from the SPR is only 4.4 million barrels per day. The United States consumes roughly 20 million barrels per day. That means even if you drained every last barrel out of the reserve at maximum speed, it would cover barely 20% of daily consumption, and it would be completely empty in about 55 days. That is not a safety net. That is a countdown clock. And we are draining it right now in the middle of the most volatile energy crisis since the 1970s, hoping that the war ends and the strait reopens before the clock runs out. And here is the part that makes this even more reckless. Congress has already mandated the sale of an additional 99.6 million barrels from the SPR by the end of fiscal year 2031, as spending offsets for other legislation. Those mandated sales were written into law years before anyone imagined we would be burning through the reserve to fight a war-driven oil crisis. So the reserve is not just being drained by the current emergency. It is being drained by the structural decisions that politicians made years ago when they treated the SPR like a piggy bank to fund unrelated budget items. Since 2015, Congress has passed 8 different laws directing the sale of oil from the strategic reserve to pay for everything from highway funding to government modernization programs. They sold the insurance policy to pay for office furniture, and now the house is on fire, and the insurance is half gone. The people who made those decisions will never face consequences. The people who live with the results are you and your family. And here is where this gets truly dangerous, because the financial ripple effects are already spreading far beyond the gas pump and the grocery store. The March 2026 Consumer Price Index came in like a freight train. CPI inflation surged 0.9% in a single month and jumped to 3.3% year over year, up from 2.4% just 1 month earlier. Rising energy prices drove the bulk of that increase, and economists are projecting it gets worse before it gets better. Analysts at EY Parthenon estimate that headline CPI inflation will hit 3.6% in April or May, with core inflation rising toward 2.9% by June. That creates a nightmare scenario for the Federal Reserve. The Fed has been trying to cut interest rates to support a slowing economy, but inflation driven by an energy supply shock makes rate cuts almost impossible. If the Fed cuts rates while inflation is rising, it pours gasoline on a fire. If the Fed holds rates steady or raises them, it chokes an already weakening economy. Mortgage rates, which were at 5.99% on February 27th, have already climbed to 6.29%. And the International Monetary Fund just issued its World Economic Outlook, projecting global growth will slow to 3.1% in 2026, with the explicit warning that a prolonged conflict raises the prospect of a major energy crisis. The IMF said downside risks dominate the outlook. The European Central Bank has already postponed planned interest rate cuts, raised its inflation forecast, and warned that energy-dependent economies face high risks of technical recession if the maritime blockade persists through the summer. The UK expects inflation to breach 5%. Germany and Italy are being warned of possible technical recession by year-end. This is not just an American problem. This is a global economic event, and the United States is sitting at the center of it because we started the war that triggered it. Let me tell you something that most people have not even thought about yet, and it is the part of this crisis that keeps me up at night. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil highway and a fertilizer highway. It is also a critical corridor for liquefied natural gas. Qatar, the world's second-largest LNG exporter, ships virtually all of its output through the strait. Europe gets between 12 and 14% of its LNG from Qatar. And Europe entered this crisis with historically low gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a brutally cold 2025 to 2026 winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks, the European natural gas price benchmark, nearly doubled to over €60 per megawatt hour by mid-March. Shell, one of the largest energy companies on the planet, issued a public warning that Europe could face a shortage of fuel as early as April. A shortage of fuel in Europe in 2026. Now you might be thinking, that is Europe's problem, not mine. But here is why it matters to you. American LNG export facilities are already running at near peak capacity, exporting almost 18 billion cubic feet per day in March 2026, close to the all-time record set in December 2025. Europe and Asia are willing to pay a massive premium for American LNG because their alternative supply through the strait is cut off. That creates a tug-of-war between domestic natural gas supply and export demand. More gas flowing to Europe means less gas available to keep American electricity prices stable, and natural gas powers roughly 40% of U.S. electricity generation. You might not think you have a connection to the Strait of Hormuz, but when your electric bill goes up this summer, because natural gas prices are being pulled higher by global demand, that is the strait speaking directly into your household budget. And then there is the dimension of this crisis that nobody wants to talk about because it exposes just how fragile the global system has become. The conflict has not just disrupted oil and gas, it has disrupted aluminum, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and the entire petrochemical supply chain. 9% of global aluminum production occurs in the Persian Gulf, and 3/4 of that is exported. Aluminum prices have hit multi-year highs, raising input costs for the transportation industry, the construction industry, the packaging industry, and the defense industry. Chemical and steel manufacturers across Europe have already imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. American manufacturers of personal care products, food packaging, auto parts, and building materials are watching their input costs climb week by week. A small manufacturer in Wisconsin told reporters that his shipping costs have already risen between 30 and 40% since the war began, on top of the tariff-driven cost increases he absorbed last year. He said if fuel prices stay elevated through early summer, he will have to raise consumer prices for the second consecutive year, something his company has never done before, and he is not alone. That story is playing out across thousands of small and medium-sized businesses in every state in this country. They are squeezed between rising input costs and consumers who are already stretched to the breaking point. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey already showed that Americans are the most pessimistic about the economy they have been in months, and the director of consumer surveys said plainly that many consumers blame the Iran conflict for unfavorable changes to the economy. 6 in 10 Republicans polled by the Associated Press said they are at least somewhat concerned about affording gas in the next few months. 6 in 10 of the president's own party. When the people who voted for the administration that started the war are telling pollsters they are worried about paying for gas, that tells you everything you need to know about where this is heading politically and economically. And here is the thing that really makes my blood run cold. The Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress released a state-by-state analysis showing that families in every single state are already spending significantly more on gasoline than they were before February 28th. Not some states, every state, from Oklahoma, where gas is still relatively cheap at $3.27, to California, where it is nearly $5. The average American household drives roughly 12,000 miles per year. At current gas prices versus pre-war prices, that translates to hundreds of additional dollars per year in fuel costs alone, before you factor in the higher prices for everything else that rides on a truck. Something has to give, and what usually gives is either the business itself or the price you pay at the register. Now, let me bring this all together, because what I have just described to you is not a collection of separate problems. It is one interconnected chain reaction, and the trigger was a single geographic choke point that most Americans cannot point to on a globe. Iran controls the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz. That is a geographic fact that no amount of military force can change. You can blockade Iran's ports. You can send destroyers through the strait. You can threaten to destroy every bridge and power plant in the country, as the president has already done. But Iran's coastline is still there. Iran's anti-ship missiles are still there. Iran's anti-ship missiles are still there. Iran's anti-ship missiles are still there. Iran's naval mines are still there, and according to at least one report, Iran has lost track of some of the mines it planted, which means even Iran itself cannot fully guarantee safe passage anymore. Navy officials have previously described the strait as an Iranian killbox filled with anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and mines, and we just sent 2 destroyers into it. The IRGC responded by saying any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would meet a severe response. China called the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Spain's defense minister said it makes no sense. Britain and France have refused to join the effort. And the ceasefire talks in Islamabad collapsed when Iran would not commit to abandoning its nuclear program. On April 12, Vice President Vance announced that the talks had failed entirely. The diplomatic off-ramp is narrowing, the military pressure is escalating, and every single day that the strait remains functionally closed is another day that oil does not flow, fertilizer does not move, LNG does not ship, and prices across the global economy continue to climb. So here is what I need you to understand, and I mean this as directly as I can possibly say it. The United States of America, the largest oil producer on Earth, is not immune to what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. We are not energy independent in the way that matters. Our refineries need foreign heavy crude. Our fertilizer supply depends on Gulf exports. Our natural gas is being pulled offshore by desperate European and Asian buyers. Our strategic petroleum reserve is being drained at a rate that cannot be sustained. Our inflation just spiked to its highest monthly jump in years. Our farmers are heading into planting season facing the most expensive input costs in a generation. And our military is now physically blockading the most important energy choke point on the planet in the middle of a war where the other side controls the geography. One move by Iran, one decision to escalate, one mine that drifts into the wrong shipping lane, one anti-ship missile that hits the wrong tanker, and the price of oil does not go to $100, it goes to $150. It goes to $200. The IRGC said it themselves. If you can tolerate oil at more than $200 per barrel, continue this game. At $200 oil, the national average gas price does not stay at $4.16. It goes past $6, past $7. Diesel goes past $8. Trucking companies shut down by the thousands. Grocery shelves start showing gaps. Inflation does not tick up a few tenths of a percent. It explodes. And the Federal Reserve has no good options because the problem is not demand. The problem is supply. You cannot fix a supply shock with interest rates. You cannot drill your way out of a refinery mismatch. You cannot eat a strategic petroleum reserve that is already half empty. This is the most vulnerable the American energy system has been since the 1973 oil embargo, and most people in this country are going about their day as if nothing has changed. Something has changed. Something enormous has changed. And by the time the average American realizes it, the prices will already be baked in, the damage will already be done, and the people who understood what was coming will be the only ones who were prepared. I want to leave you with this thought because it is the one that cuts deepest. Before this war started, Americans were already struggling. Tariffs had already raised prices on imported goods, consumer debt was already at record levels, credit card delinquencies were already climbing. The average household was already spending more on groceries, rent, insurance, and car payments than at any point in the last 20 years. People were already living paycheck to paycheck. And then we dropped bombs on a country that controls the northern shore of the most important energy choke point on Earth, and we acted surprised when they closed it. Nobody asked you. Nobody explained to the American public that the consequence of this action would be $4 gas within weeks and the potential for $6 or $7 gas within months. Nobody told the farmer in Iowa that his fertilizer costs were about to spike 35% during planting season. Nobody told the trucker in South Dakota that his fuel bill was about to make his business unprofitable. Nobody told the mother of 3 in Florida that her grocery bill was about to eat into the money she was saving for her kids' school supplies. Those conversations did not happen, because having them would have required admitting the truth, which is that the United States is not as insulated from global energy markets as our leaders pretend, and the decision to go to war has consequences that reach all the way down to the price of eggs at your local store. So do yourself a favor, take this seriously. Look at what you are paying at the pump today versus what you were paying 8 weeks ago. Look at your grocery receipts. Look at your electric bill. And ask yourself one question. If this does not resolve in the next 30 days, what does my budget look like in 90? Because that is the question that nobody in Washington is answering. And it is the only question that actually matters for your family. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me which part hit you the hardest. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications, because this situation is developing by the hour, and I am going to keep breaking it down as it unfolds. No spin, no agenda, just the data and what it actually means for your life. Take care of yourselves out there. Take care of your families, and I will see you in the next one.